What is philosophy? Who counts as a philosopher? And what are philosophers supposed to be doing? What should they be like? These are meta-philosophical questions. These are questions that are philosophical, but they're about the very discipline of philosophy itself. Some people call it the philosophy of philosophy. Others call it meta-philosophy. Now, these may not seem ultra important to you, but I've been thinking about them for a long, long time. And a few years ago, I finally found a book that gave me some answers. But the book wasn't a philosophy book. It was a science fiction book. Welcome to ParkNotes. I'm Parker Settecase. I'm a philosopher and theologian, and this is a channel where I help you study, think, and read more deeply. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the science fiction book that saved my philosophy, that reinvigorated how I view philosophy, that gave me a broader picture of the discipline. I don't have to leave you guys in suspense. It's Dune Messiah by Frank Herbert. I know that's going to sound pretty weird to a lot of you, but this thing changed the way I view philosophy. So I'm going to explain how this book changed my philosophy. That's going to be really beneficial to those who are interested in philosophy, who are just getting into it, or even those who've been into it for a long time. This may help you like it helped me. I'll also be covering the concept of the philosophical sage from more ancient philosophy. I think that conversation is going to be really beneficial for those who get upset that I call myself a philosopher. So I'm going to talk about a distinction between a philosopher and a sage. I think there's some miscommunication going on, but we'll see. This is the ParkNotes channel, so of course I'm going to be talking about philosophical notebook habits to help you in your own philosophical journey, and then I'll also leave you with a bunch of philosophy book recommendations. So make sure you watch the full video. Now, before we jump in with Dune Messiah, I want to talk about a distinction between a philosopher and a sage. I've noticed that in my ParkNotes videos, in the comment section, some people get upset that I call myself a philosopher. They think the term philosopher is like an honorific. It's something that you can't really describe yourself as. It'd be like calling yourself wise, going around saying, I'm super wise. Hey, I'm a wise man. Hey, I'm super wise. You should listen to me. If that's what philosopher means, then I totally understand being upset by someone calling themselves a philosopher. But the term philosopher is not really an honorific. It's something that you can specialize in. It's something you can go to school for, and it's something that you can do. There are actually a bunch of different ways that you can be a philosopher. You can be an academic philosopher who works in the academy, who teaches people philosophy. You can be a professional philosopher. Most of the academic philosophers are going to be professional philosophers and vice versa, but that's someone who makes their living from philosophy. You don't have to be in the academy to be a professional philosopher. There are professional philosophers on YouTube who make their living teaching philosophy outside of the academy. You can be a lay philosopher, someone who has not been academically trained, but nonetheless has studied a bunch of philosophy. And there may even be lay philosophers who are much better than academic philosophers. There are public philosophers who make their living by teaching philosophy to the public. We've already mentioned YouTube, but there's actually some philosophers who go around speaking at like business conferences, and they make a bunch of money teaching philosophy to businessmen and women. When I think of public philosophers, I think of Mortimer Adler, or I think of Tom Morris. These are very public philosophers who made a great living speaking about philosophy at giant conferences. There are a bunch of different modes of philosophy. There's Continental philosophy and Analytic philosophy, traditional or classical philosophy. There are philosophers who specialize in logic and then move over into the tech sphere as ontology engineers or professional logicians, people who utilize their logic training in the tech space, in artificial intelligence. And then there's a whole spectrum of the quality of philosophy that a philosopher does. You can be a really bad philosopher, or you can be a really good philosopher. Being a philosopher just means that you're doing philosophy. I think it's really easy to be a philosopher. I think it's exceptionally difficult to be a good philosopher. And it's like impossible to be a very good philosopher. So there's a whole spectrum of the quality of philosophy. There's a bunch of different modes of philosophy. There's a bunch of different ways that someone can be considered a philosopher, and the bar is super low for entry. But a sage, on the other hand, is something much different. A sage is an honorific. It's a term for a wise man or a wise woman. It's like way up here. Some philosophical traditions held that a sage was not actually attainable. It was just an unattainable ideal. It's like the North Star. All the philosophers are aiming at it, knowing that they could never actually achieve sagehood. Other traditions pointed to an actual philosopher as their ideal sage, like Socrates. And early apologists and Christian philosophers pointed to Jesus as the ideal philosophical sage. Now, I don't think a sage would go around describing themselves as a sage. I think their wisdom just flows out of them, and the people they come in contact with recognize them as being a sage. So all this to say, if someone said, hey, I'm a philosopher, in my book, it's like, Oh, okay, yeah, that's not really saying all that much. But if someone says, hey, I'm a sage, then you might be a little bit concerned about that. You may be wary. You may think, I don't know if you are a sage if you're describing yourself as such. So when I call myself a philosopher, it's because I have advanced degrees in philosophy. I spend all my time doing and reading philosophy, and I'm trying to do it in lots of different modes. I publish academic works, but I also do public philosophy. I love it. I just want to do it all day long. I think that I finally found my calling, and it's to be a philosopher. Now, that doesn't say anything about the quality of my philosophy. Maybe you think I'm a terrible philosopher. That very well could be. I'm actively working on it. I want to hone my skills and become a really good philosopher, but that doesn't mean I am one right now. But speaking of callings, that reminds me of the sponsor for this video, 80,000 Hours. 80,000 Hours is a nonprofit that helps people find careers aimed at solving the world's most pressing problems. If your experience is anything like mine, then I'm sure you've taken one of those aptitude tests in school where they ask you to just list a bunch of your preferences. Hey, do you like working outside? Would you rather work with people or with things? And then it tells you that you should be like an engineer or something. And then you just feel confused about what it's even based on or why you've been recommended that career path. Most career advice is really cookie cutter in nature. It focuses on a few mainstream and obvious paths and doesn't take into account the best available evidence we have for how to actually find a fulfilling career. Relevant career advice can be really hard to find if you care a lot about doing good. That is, if you want to have a career that makes a big, positive difference in the world. Many sources on this topic only recommend a few well-known career paths that people often think have a high social impact, like being a doctor, teacher, or charity worker, but it turns out those aren't your only options, and they probably aren't your best options either. 80,000 Hours is a nonprofit that aims to help you find a career that is both fulfilling and makes a big positive difference. The name comes from the number of hours in an average career. There are 40 hours in a work week, 50 weeks in a year, for 40 years, and boom, you get 80,000 hours. Now that's a lot of time, and it means your career is probably your biggest opportunity to have an impact. 80,000 Hours have done over 10 years of research into how to find a fulfilling career path that does a lot of good. All of their recommendations are based on careful research and consultation with experts in relevant fields. If you care about what the evidence actually says about having a fulfilling and impactful career and want real advice that goes beyond empty cliches like follow your passion, then 80,000 Hours can help. Oh, and everything they provide is free forever because they're a nonprofit. Their only aim is to help solve global problems by helping people find the most impactful careers they can. If you join the newsletter now, you'll get a free copy of their in-depth career guide sent right to your inbox. Just sign up now at 80,000hours.org/ParkNotes. Okay, so big thanks to 80,000 Hours for sponsoring this video. Now let's jump in with some details on how Dune Messiah saved my philosophy. So like I said before, there are a bunch of different modes of philosophy, one of them being analytic philosophy, and that is usually set against Continental philosophy. Analytic being the style of philosophy that prioritizes clarity and rigor and logic. They also use the symbols of symbolic logic in order to get more clear on their definitions and what they're talking about and their arguments. This is opposed to Continental philosophy. The analytics are usually the Anglo-American philosophers, those in the United States and in the UK, whereas the Continental philosophers are from the continent of Europe. And they're often lambasted by the analytic tradition as being unclear, using metaphorical language, and even making up their own terms just on the spot, which don't really pick out anything at all. Now, I think that's actually super unfair. I've come around to liking Continental philosophy a lot more than I used to. I still prefer analytic to Continental philosophy, but I think the Continentals ask really big, really juicy, really good questions, though they don't always provide the best explanations to those questions, whereas the analytics may focus more on pedantic-y type questions, though they bring logic and rigor to answering those questions that most people don't care about. But I've been trained mostly in the analytic tradition, trying to focus on logic and rigor and clarity and all that. Even in my theology work, I preferred to study analytic theology to just regular theology, which has to do much more with Continental philosophers. And in my formal education in analytic philosophy and analytic theology, I drank the Kool-Aid. I thought that being an analytic was the pinnacle, was the top, was the best. And anyone else, any other mode of philosophy was not very good. So I became kind of an analytic philosophy snob. But then with that, I became disillusioned with analytic philosophy because they weren't doing philosophy that people really cared about. It seemed like analytic philosophy was written for other analytic philosophers in the ivory tower, but didn't have a lot of practical applications for people who wanted to study philosophy outside of the academy. That's just what I thought. That doesn't mean it's true or anything like that. My characterizations of all these different modes of philosophy could totally be wrong, and they probably are, but this is a characterization that I picked up from studying analytic philosophy, from studying some continental philosophy, and interacting with these types of philosophers on my podcast, Parker's Pensées. So all this to say, I became disillusioned with philosophy. I didn't even really understand what that was, why we're doing it, why modern day philosophers aren't really super wise people. Like they're people who do philosophy in a particular way, but do they rightly count as lovers of wisdom? I wasn't so sure. So I was in the midst of a master's degree in analytic philosophy, and I was starting to doubt whether I even liked this thing at all. And that's when I found Frank Herbert's Dune Messiah, and it changed everything for me. So I don't want to get into all the details of the story, Dune Messiah. I'm not going to give any spoilers here. If you guys want to see more in-depth analysis of the book and the philosophy present in the book, then check out my YouTube channel, Truth Suffers. It's all about science fiction and fantasy and philosophy. The name Truth Suffers comes from a quote from this book. Frank Herbert says, "Truth suffers from too much analysis." And that was a really big quote for me when I realized, hey, wait, that's actually true. The analytics don't have the whole corner on philosophy. There are some other things that maybe the analytics miss because they're so focused on logic and rigor. They do miss metaphors. They do miss analogical language. They don't like analogies at all. If you talk to an analytic philosopher, they always critique analogical predication or analogy, and they say there has to be some kind of univocal core to analogy. We need to just do away with it to just explain the core meaning at stake here. If you can't explain it rigorously in univocal language, then it doesn't matter, or it's fake, or it's not actually picking out something genuine or interesting. Of all the generalizations that I'm going to bring up in this video, that one is the most true. Ask an analytic philosopher about analogy and analogical predication, saying things with using analogies, and they will all talk about the univocal core that must be there. That's spot on. That's going to happen. So anyways, I started reading Dune Messiah in preparation for Dune Part 1 that came out in 2021, I think. And it was just the perfect time for me to be reading this book because Frank Herbert loaded so much good philosophical sagery in this book. There's this character named Hate. I can't really say who it is because that will be a spoiler, but he's trained as a Zen Sunni mentat. The Zen Sunnis are these desert wanderers. They are the ancient ancestors of the Fremen, and they would wander the desert and give each other proverbs and maxims and aphorisms. They are an agglomeration of the Zen Buddhists and the Sunni Muslims, which is, unique and interesting to mash those two together in the first place. But those are Zen Sunni philosophers, folks who like riddles and maxims and aphorisms and proverbs, wise sayings. This is like the wisdom tradition of philosophy. So Hate is a Gola. He's a reincarnation. He's a resuscitated character who died, who has come back to life. And the Teliaxu are the ones who brought him back to life. They trained him as a mentat. Mentats are like the rigorous analytic philosophers, the analytic physicists, those who are really good with predictions and mathematics and probabilities. They trained him as that, as the mentat, and as a Zen Sunni philosopher who deals in riddles and symbolism and mythology and analogies and metaphors, all that. So the Teliaxu, it's not super important who they are. They made this one person, they brought him back to life, and they trained him as a mentat and a Zen Sunni philosopher. So one person is a wise old desert sage and a rigorous analytic of analytics type philosopher, all together in one person. Now, when I first read this, it just blew my mind. I was like, wait, yes, that's actually the best philosophy of philosophy. That's the best meta-philosophy out there. That's what a philosopher should be like. They should be able to give you a riddle when it's most fitting, but they should also be able to give you a rigorous, logical syllogism, an argument with premises and a conclusion that's super clear when that's fitting. They should be able to do both. A philosopher should be a Zen Sunni mentat. They should be able to give you Bayesian probabilities, but they should also be able to give you a proverb, a maxim, or an aphorism when you need it most. Now, it takes a lot of wisdom to know your audience, to know who needs what and when. That is not something you can have a formula for. That is just what a wise person does in a given scenario. Now, I know it's really goofy because we're using all these different words, these made-up words from a science fiction world, but that was totally eye-opening to me. I finally found a term that can describe the type of philosopher that I would like to be. It's a Zen Sunni mentat. Now, I'm not super sure why Frank Herbert put that in this book. I don't think he was trying to do philosophy of philosophy, meta-philosophy. I think it was just a really cool tool for Hate, this character who turns out to be someone else. No spoilers here. I think he accidentally came up with a really good description for this ancient concept of the philosophical sage. He also put a phrase in here that almost perfectly captures the philosophy student's experience. So in context here, Paul Atreides is having this crazy dream where he sees a moon falling to Arrakis. And he's trying to get the meaning of this dream. So he asks Hate to be a Zen Sunni and give him an interpretation of his dream. Play the Zen Sunni, Paul said bitterly. Meanings within meanings. What could a Zen Sunni philosopher say or do to change one jot of the reality unrolling before them in this instant? So then Paul describes his dream to Hate. He says, I saw a moon fall. It was gone, destroyed. I heard a great hissing. The earth shook. To which Hate replies, you are drunk on too much time. He's referring to the fact that Paul has this foresight. He has these visions. He can see through time. And Hate is saying, you've done that too much and it's messing with you. So here's the expression I was talking about. Paul says, I ask for the Zen Sunni and get the mentat. He's lamenting that fact. I asked for the wise sage and I ended up with the logic chopper. Now, I think a lot of people who enter into philosophy are looking to either become a wise sage themselves, a wisdom lover, or they're looking to study from the great wise folks of history. And they end up having to do a bunch of mathematics and logic in order to get clear on the meanings and expressions that they're trying to use in their papers. They start out seeking the Zen Sunni and they end up either becoming mentats or getting a whole face full of mentat philosophy. Now that is if you're studying in the analytic tradition. That was definitely my experience. I started off trying to become a wise person, a lover of wisdom, as the etymology of philosophy suggests. I went into philosophy not expecting to have to do a bunch of math because I'm not great with math or maths if you're not from the States. But I ended up having to learn propositional logic and all these different symbols and learn how to symbolize my arguments and put everything in syllogistic form. I asked for the Zen Sunni and I ended up with the mentat. But I'm not just bagging on analytic philosophy. I love analytic philosophy. I just think that you need more. I think you need to be a mentat, but also a Zen Sunni if you want to be a good, well-rounded philosopher. And so I just happened to read Dune Messiah at the perfect time in order to save my philosophy, to give me a broader picture, not just to unify like analytic and continental philosophy, but also to appreciate the history of philosophy and to see philosophers as more than just those in the Western tradition. I hope you guys are tracking with me. I understand that this is weird language. This may just be me having my own therapy session or something like that, but I hope that you guys are tracking at least with a little bit of this. When you start getting into philosophy, you will find yourself with proclivities. You will like this type of philosophy or this mode of philosophy more than this one. Maybe you're better at it naturally, maybe you're worse at it naturally, and you find that more of a challenge. But as you go along, if you're not watching what you're studying, you end up in a little rut, or you end up in a little silo or a little sub-community of philosophy. And that's what philosophy becomes to you. And if that's the case, maybe you won't be able to speak intelligently about another sub-discipline, a subfield within philosophy that someone in your community cares about. So I think a philosopher should be a Zen Sunni mentat type person. Maybe you're more mentat than Zen Sunni or vice versa. But I think that a philosopher is a community's wise man or wise woman. And I think the community needs are going to shape how you do philosophy more and more. If your community is just your family, that's going to look different than if your community is like a YouTube community or a analytic community in an analytic academy, or a continental community in a continental academy, or if you're more into history and the history of ideas, or if you're into the history of philosophy, which is like a cousin to the history of ideas, but which is more philosophical in nature and has less to do with the historical background of the thinker than you're going to find in the history of ideas tradition. So again, all this to say, your community will help dictate the style of philosophy that you are engaged in, the mode that you present your philosophy in. But If you're a philosopher, I think you ought to be doing both. You actually should be a wisdom lover, and you should also be able to present your stuff in clear, concise ways. I think this is part of the reason why in Boethius's Constellation of Philosophy, he has this lady philosophy, this like supernatural being who comes and visits him. She's the embodiment of philosophy itself. On the bottom hem of her dress, she has the Greek letter pi, which stands for like practical philosophy, ethics, wisdom, all that kind of stuff. And then on the top hem of her dress, she has a theta, which stands for like theology, metaphysics, natural sciences, theoretical philosophy. She doesn't have one over against the other. She has both practical and theoretical philosophy. That's what I think Herbert is picking out. The Zensunni has to do with the pi. It is practical reasoning, practical philosophy, and the mentat has more to do with the abstract, abstruse, theoretical philosophy. Now, ethics is usually considered practical philosophy, but you can do analytic ethics in a really impractical way. That's not really what I have in mind here. I'm talking about aphorisms and proverbs. Like read the book of Proverbs. That is practical philosophy for how to live a good life. In academic philosophy today, you're not going to hear a whole ton on the good life, what it looks like to live a good life, how to go about becoming a wise and virtuous person. I think we need to pull that back in. That's like the Zensunni stuff. But you also have to be clear and concise and rigorous in your thinking. That's the analytic. That's the more formal, theoretical type philosophy. I think we need both. And these words, Zensunni, mentat, just help me so much. So that's partially how Dune Messiah has reinvigorated my philosophy. I know that this is not everyone's favorite Dune book. It may be my favorite, actually. I love it so much, and that's because I read it at a time when I was really despairing of studying philosophy, and it helped a ton. But I also understand what Herbert was trying to do here. He thought that people who were reading Dune idolized Paul in a way that he was trying to avoid, and so he tried to deconstruct Paul in here. I think he probably failed again, and Paul ends up being a likable character despite Frank Herbert's best efforts. But again, if you want to hear more about that, then subscribe to my channel, Truth Suffers. You can find a link in the description. But enough about Dune Messiah. Let me give some philosophy book recommendations for you to get started becoming a Zensunni mentat in your own right. So first things first, let me give some recommendations that also back up my idea about a Zensunni mentat, but in these books, they're called a philosophical sage. I prefer the Frank Herbert language better because sage has its own baggage, as we talked about in the beginning of this video. I tend to think that sages are unattainable, or at least if you become a sage, you can't really talk about it yourself. Just for whatever reason, Zensunni mentat is much easier for me. Maybe not for you. But the first book is Philosophy as a Way of Life. This is by Pierre Hadot. This is a collection of essays on the nature of philosophy. It's philosophy of philosophy type stuff, but he really takes seriously ancient philosophy. For all of you who are interested in Stoicism, this is going to be awesome. You're going to love this. But one of his key emphases is that philosophy is a type of therapy. It's not just the theoretical, abstract, abstruse philosophy. The tools of philosophy can actually be therapeutic for you and help you live that good life. So if you're into philosophy at all, I highly recommend Pierre Hadot's Philosophy as a Way of Life. Now, related to that book is Jesus as Philosopher. I always have a hard time with this name. Runar M. Thorstensen, I believe. But this is Jesus as Philosopher, the moral sage in the Synoptic Gospels. In the first chapter, he talks all about this ancient idea of the philosophical sage. I think this is probably one of the best short pieces on the philosophical sage that I've ever read. Maybe you're not into Christianity and the Synoptic Gospels or anything like that. Real quick, actually, the Synoptic Gospels are called synoptic, like seen together, because they all pull from a common source, whether that's Mark or some mystery document called K. Whatever the case, it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is doing his own thing, but those three books pull from similar sources. They're Synoptic Gospels. Okay, that one's just for free. I highly recommend this book because of how he treats the philosophical sage. He goes on to argue that early Christians saw Christ as a philosophical sage, but in so doing, he explains the concept super well and demonstrates that ancient philosophy really prioritized the ideal of the philosophical sage. These two concepts weren't separated. The wisdom tradition and the philosophical tradition were not rent asunder. They were unified and very much part of the same thing. Next up, following in the tradition of seeing other people as philosophers, not just Western philosophers, I want to recommend Drew Johnson's book, Biblical Philosophy. Drew Johnson is awesome. I had a podcast episode on Parker's Pensées with him on this book. Super cool. He's got a PhD in theology, but he's also got a master's in analytic philosophy. He speaks about philosophy in a really, really cool way that will expand your concept of the discipline. He looks a lot at Jewish rabbis and how they fit the mold of the philosophical sage. So super cool. Next up, I'm going to recommend Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy. This book's awesome. I've been recommending it in a lot of my videos. It's super short. You could probably read it in an afternoon. I've read it in all 3 of my master's degrees. I probably read it in undergrad. I've read this book a ton because it's been assigned to me, but then also my mentors have said you have to read it. So I've read this book a ton. It's so good. I love this book, and I'm actually using it to write my science fiction novel right now. So super cool. Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy. He is a really good example of a Zen Sunni mentat, of a philosophical sage. This guy collated the 7 liberal arts, the first 3 of which are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So he's really an analytical thinker, but he also wrote this sagacious soliloquy / divine dialogue with lady philosophy in there. So he's a great example of what I'm talking about when I think of the ideal philosopher. But speaking of ideal philosophers, you got to talk about Socrates, at least Plato's rendition of Socrates. This is the Penguin Classics, The Last Days of Socrates. It has 4 of the best dialogues of Plato. It includes the Phaedo, the Crito, the Apology of Socrates, that's his defense, and the Euthyphro, which is probably my favorite of Plato's dialogues. So I highly recommend this. Again, Plato is great at bringing together the Zen Sunni and the mentat all in one spot, and giving it in more of a novel-like form where you're reading a dialogue between 2 or more personifications of different ideas. So that's great. Also, I have to recommend The Republic. I know a lot of people don't like The Republic. I love it. It's one of my favorite books. I'm rereading it right now, and it's fantastic. Next up, I'll give you a philosophy of philosophy recommendation. This is Timothy Williamson's Philosophical Method. It's a very short introduction in the Oxford series of very short introductions. Timothy Williamson is like the Analytic of analytics. His academic stuff gets pretty difficult to read, but this short little piece is super beneficial for thinking about what philosophy is, what philosophers should be doing, and it's at least one particular conception of the philosophy of philosophy. Super short, really clear and concise. I recommend this one. Maybe another one on the more analytic side of things is Being Logical by D.Q. McInerney. This is a guide to good thinking. This is a logic book. It's an introduction to logic. It's very easy to read. It's very short, but he covers all the stuff you need to cover. It's a good primer. It's a good entry point into studying the logic that philosophers use. So another really good one. Next up, this is going to hurt some people's feelings, but I have a book by Roger Scruton. This is Philosophy, Principles, and Problems. I think he does a great job of bringing together the analytic and continental traditions. And he says, hey, look, continentals have good questions. Not always the easiest answers, but the analytics miss out on a lot by totally avoiding the continental questions and tradition. So he kind of brings them together himself. I like this book. It's short. It's concise. It's really good. If you look, there's a bunch of marginal notes and highlights because I read this a couple times and it was helpful for me. So Roger Scruton's Philosophy, Principles, and Problems. Another really great one. This probably should be higher up on the list. If you're going to get one, maybe get this one. It's Mortimer J. Adler's Aristotle for Everybody. Adler is like the quintessential public philosopher. I love the way this guy thinks. I love his practical philosophy, his emphasis on the history of philosophy, and the great books tradition. He's great. This guy is awesome. And Aristotle for Everybody is a fantastic book, which is worth buying, if only for chapter 3 on man's 3 dimensions, which is a concept that was from Plato that Aristotle also talked about, which you find in lots and lots of ancient philosophy. So Aristotle for Everybody. If you're going to get one book, maybe grab this one. Now, I've mentioned continental philosophy a few times in this video, so let me give you a recommendation. This is a chunk of a book. This is a Routledge Intro to book, and it's Intro to Continental Philosophy. I have been trained as an analytic, so I have a hard time with a lot of continental stuff. I'm working on it. I'm getting better. But I found this Routledge book to be really helpful, especially in looking at the broad scope of continental philosophy. This is kind of continental philosophy as presented for analytic philosophers. So I found it to be super helpful just to go through the different themes, to thematize Continental philosophy, to give us some common hooks for hanging things on across all these disparate thinkers. That's one of the problems with Continental philosophy is it's not really a good description of what's going on here, because you have these existentialists and postmodernists, and are they really even saying the same stuff at all? How do you categorize these folks? Well, I think Andrew Cutrofello, who wrote this book, does a fantastic job. I wish he'd come on the podcast to talk with me about it, but I'm still working on that. So that's Continental Philosophy, A Contemporary Introduction. All of these books will be linked in the description, so find those there. So now I've given at least one Continental recommendation. I've given some analytic ones. I've given some philosophical sagey type stuff. I've also given some classical thinkers like Plato, and we've talked about a secondary source on Aristotle. But here's a really good secondary source on classical philosophy, classical Western philosophy by Peter Adamson. This is a history of philosophy without any gaps. It's based on his work in his podcast by the same name. And this is a very good overview of ancient philosophical thinkers in the Western tradition. An added bonus of this is that you can listen along to the podcast while you're reading, or read a chapter here, listen to a podcast episode, or vice versa, whatever. But that's going to be really helpful for you to get a good grasp on ancient thinkers. Then lastly, I'll leave you with two books from the wisdom tradition. These are both philosophers and scientists, which is really cool. First up, we have Blaise Pascal's Pensées. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I named my podcast after Pascal's Pensées, though I say Pensées because I'm an American swine, and it sounds weird to have a Chicago-y accent and then introduce the podcast as Parker's Pensées. It's just weird, but I know how to pronounce it. I just choose not to. Pascal's Pensées is beautiful, awesome. If you want to learn how to write aphorisms, then you need this book. And then lastly is Georg Lichtenberg's The Waste Books. These are very good examples of what a pure and perfect aphorism looks like. The introduction to this alone is worth the book, but the aphorisms inside are also beautiful and thought-provoking and wonderful. Now, I forgot to mention that I've done a lot of videos on a lot of the things I've already talked about. There's a video on logical thinking, on being a rigorous analytic thinker. I forgot what it's called. Something like How to Think Logically. I'll leave a link to that in the description. I've also done a recent video on aphoristic philosophy, on how to think like a wise wizard. That will be in the description as well. I've given some other philosophy recommendations. You can find that link in the description. Now I'll just leave you with a couple tips for using a notebook to become a Zen Sunni mentat in your own right. Here I have my Dianoia journals. Now a journal is just a collection of your thoughts, whereas a diary is going to be a collection of your experiences and your emotions. So a Dianoia journal is just where you think through your thoughts. This is where you're going to come up with some kind of idea or prompt to think through there on the page, to practice discursive thought. That is to think in a chain of thoughts. Maybe you come up with an argument and then you argue against that argument. You provide counterpoints and counter arguments to your argument, and then you argue against those. But whatever the case, you're getting clear on what you believe and why you believe it. Here I have a Murdy Creative Co. number 2 on a Leuchtturm 1917 A5, and I have a Waterman fountain pen. I've been loving this setup right here. I also have a saddleback leather cover for a Leuchtturm 1917 A5, and this just has a Pilot G205. I love both of these. I'm still trying them out, so I use both of these as a Dianoia journal. I love both of these companies. If you check the links in the description, you can get a 10% discount with Murdy, and you can find the saddleback cover there. Now, lastly, I have a book of aphorisms. This is where I'm practicing my Zen Sunni aphorisms. I'm trying to come up with my own wise sayings. Now, again, if you want to learn more about what an aphorism is, check out the link in the description on how to journal like a wise wizard. But this has been super huge for my journaling habits. I don't always like journaling about my thoughts. I don't always like doing the diachronic thing. I don't always have the mental energy to sit down and write something out like that. But I am trying to write at least one aphorism every single day. Aphorisms are brief, isolated, witty, and philosophical. These are really fun to come up with, and it's a nice way to journal about your thoughts in really pithy, fun, concise ways. So in my head, I have the Zen Sunni and I have the mentat modes of doing philosophy in notebooks. You don't have to separate these out. You can keep it all in one notebook, whatever, or you can use it in some kind of digital format if you like that too. But I definitely like to compartmentalize, because when I thumb through these notebooks, it gets me in the right state of mind to be doing that kind of philosophy. All right, so that was a lot. If you guys made it this far into the video, then leave me a little thinking emoji so I know who the real ones are. I hope that the Zen Sunni mentat stuff from Dune Messiah. I hope that was influential for you. I hope you got something out of that conversation. If not, then maybe the philosophical sage language is better for you. And if nothing else, at least you have a bunch of philosophy book recommendations to jump into. All right, that's going to do it for now. I'll catch you guys next time.